Before you watch another second of this video, I need you to understand something about the men who cut timber before 1913. They didn't just work dangerous jobs. They participated in a daily ritual of controlled catastrophe, where the difference between going home and being carried home in pieces came down to the mood of a 1,200-pound draft horse, the integrity of a rusted chain link, or whether the morning frost had made the skid road just slick enough to turn a routine log haul into a death sentence. The Pacific Northwest timber industry in the early 1900s killed more men per capita than coal mining, more than railroad construction, more than any other peacetime occupation in American history. And the men who died weren't killed by falling trees, at least not most of them. They were killed by what happened after the tree hit the ground. They were killed trying to move logs that weighed more than locomotives, using nothing but animal muscle, hemp rope, and a prayer. Every morning in timber country started the same way. Before dawn, while the cold still hurt to breathe, men would walk from bunkhouses to the cook shack for a meal that had to sustain them through 12 hours of physical labor. They ate without speaking because speaking took energy, and energy was currency you couldn't afford to waste. Then they walked into the forest, their boots crunching on frozen ground, carrying tools that weighed more than some men could lift, cross-cut saws that stretched 7 feet long, double-bit axes with 4-pound heads, peavies and cant hooks, and the endless coils of manila rope that connected man to animal to machine. The work didn't stop for weather, it barely stopped for injury. A broken finger got wrapped in a dirty rag and you went back to work. A gash that needed stitches got stitches without anesthetic, right there in the cutting site, administered by whatever man happened to have steady hands that day. The company doctor, if the camp had one at all, was reserved for injuries serious enough to end your working life. Anything less than that, you handled yourself or you didn't handle it at all. In 1912 alone, the state of Washington recorded 417 logging deaths. That's more than one man per day. Every single day for an entire year. And those were just the deaths they bothered to count. The ones that happened on company land, where a foreman was present, where somebody thought to write it down. The real number was higher, probably much higher, because the logging camps of that era operated beyond the reach of labor laws, beyond the oversight of safety inspectors, beyond anything resembling accountability. The state labor commissioner at the time, a man named Charles Younger, wrote in his 1913 annual report that the timber industry had become, in his words, a machine for converting human beings into corpses with remarkable efficiency. He was censured by the state legislature for that comment. 3 timber companies threatened to move their operations to Oregon if he wasn't removed from his position. He wasn't removed, but he stopped publishing the more damning statistics after that. Some things were better left uncounted. If you died hauling timber in 1910, your body went home on the same train that carried the logs that killed you. Your widow got a week's wages if she was lucky, your children got nothing, and the company replaced you before sunset with another young man desperate enough to take your place. There was a term for this, one that the timber companies used internally but never printed in their public materials. They called it acceptable attrition. They calculated, with cold precision, on exactly how many men they expected to lose per million board feet of lumber produced. The number varied by terrain, by season, by the type of timber being harvested, but it always existed. It was a line item in budgets, a variable in equations, a cost of doing business that nobody questioned because questioning it served no profitable purpose. This was the world that existed before the logging truck. This was the world that one inventor, working alone in a converted barn in rural California, was about to destroy. His name was August Fruehauf, and in 1914, he would build something in his blacksmith shop that would eventually replace 10,000 horses, save countless lives, and transform the timber industry from a medieval bloodbath into something approaching a modern profession. But to understand what Fruehauf built, you first have to understand what he was replacing. You have to understand the horse. Imagine standing at the edge of a fresh timber cut in Oregon, somewhere in the Cascade foothills in the winter of 1908. The air smells like sawdust and horse sweat, and the particular metallic tang of sap freezing on freshly exposed wood. You're looking at a log, a single Douglas fir trunk, maybe 8 feet in diameter and 120 feet long. It weighs approximately 40,000 pounds. The tree came down 2 days ago. You heard it fall from half a mile away. I mean, that unmistakable crack and groan, and then the thunder of impact that shook the ground under your feet. The fallers spent 6 hours cutting it with a crosscut saw, trading off in 30-minute shifts because no man could sustain that kind of effort for longer than that. When the tree finally fell, it took 4 smaller trees with it, creating the kind of tangled devastation that makes extraction work feel less like labor and more like excavation. Now look at what's going to move it. When 8 draft horses stand in pairs, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. They're Percherons mostly, brought over from France specifically for this kind of work because no American breed had the combination of weight, muscle, and temperament needed to pull loads that would snap the legs of ordinary horses. Each animal weighs close to 2,000 pounds, and their combined pulling power, when properly harnessed and coordinated, can move roughly 60,000 pounds on a good day with decent road conditions. The horses have names. Men who worked with animals this closely always name them. There's Duke and Prince in the lead position, brothers from the same dam who've worked together for 4 years. Behind them are Thor and Odin, Belgians rather than Percherons, slightly smaller but with a low center of gravity that makes them better for downhill work. Then Jack and Jill, a mismatched pair that the teamster acquired cheap because nobody else could get them to work together. And finally, in the wheel position closest to the load, Big Mike and Little Mike, neither of whom is actually named Mike. Nobody remembers anymore how they got those names. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they're the strongest horses in camp, and they're positioned where strength matters most, at the point where the full weight of the load transfers into forward motion. That sounds like enough, doesn't it? 40,000 pounds of log, 60,000 pounds of pulling power. Simple math, log moves. But the math was never simple. The math was a lie that killed men every single day. Here's what the math didn't account for. It didn't account for the skid road, that narrow path of half-buried logs laid crosswise in the mud that served as the only transportation route from cutting site to sawmill. When the road was dry, the logs dragged across those wooden rails with reasonable efficiency. When the road was wet, the coefficients changed. Friction dropped. The load became unpredictable. A log that took 8 horses to move on Tuesday might slide freely on Wednesday, building momentum as it came, turning into a 40,000-pound projectile with nothing but men and animals in its path. The skid roads themselves were engineering marvels of a brutal kind. They stretched for miles through old-growth forest, carved out by hand with axes and shovels and the occasional stick of dynamite. Every 100 yards or so, you'd find a turn, and every turn was a potential death trap. The logs couldn't corner. They wanted to go straight, and the only thing keeping them on the road was the friction of the wooden rails beneath them. Take that friction away, add a little water or ice, and the physics changed in an instant. I've read coroner's reports from this era, and the language is clinical in a way that makes the horror worse. Cause of death, crushing trauma to thorax and abdomen. Mechanism, log departure from skid road during downhill transport. Deceased was positioned at road margin for purposes of applying grease to roadbed surface. Log struck deceased with estimated velocity of 6 to 8 miles per hour. 6 to 8 miles per hour, and that's a jogging pace. That's the speed at which 40,000 pounds of Douglas fir can destroy a human body so completely that the coroner had to identify the remains by the victim's boots. The math didn't account for breakage. Chains failed, harnesses snapped, single tree hitches, those wooden crossbars that attach the traces to the load, shattered under strain with no warning. When equipment failed, the energy had to go somewhere. Usually it went into the nearest living body. The chains were the worst. They were made of wrought iron in those days, not the case-hardened steel we use today, and wrought iron fails without warning. One moment the chain is tight, singing with tension, vibrating slightly at a frequency you can feel in your teeth. The next moment it's gone, and the broken end is moving faster than thought, whipping through the air in a deadly arc that no man can dodge. I found a letter in the Oregon Historical Society archives. I'd written by a camp foreman named Patrick Sullivan in 1911. He was writing to his sister back in Ireland, and he described watching a chain failure kill 2 men in less than a second. The sound it made, he wrote, was like nothing I can describe to you. A sort of singing noise, and then a wet noise, and then silence. I've been in this country for 20 years, and I have seen many bad things, but this I will never forget. The chain cut through them both as if they were made of nothing at all. And the math didn't account for the horses themselves. Draft horses are intelligent animals, far more intelligent than most people realize. And intelligent animals understand danger. They understood that the work they were doing was wrong, that the loads were too heavy, that the footing was treacherous, that the chains and ropes surrounding them were stretched to their breaking point, and they communicated this understanding through their behavior, the whites of their eyes showing, the nervous dancing of their hooves, the way they leaned away from a chain that was about to snap. The teamsters, the men who drove the horse teams, learned to read these signals. They called it feeling the line, that moment when a horse's muscles tensed in a particular way that meant something bad was about to happen. Good teamsters could feel trouble coming through the leather of the reins, through the slight change in resistance, through some intuition that had no name but saved their lives. But even the best teamsters couldn't prevent every catastrophe. Even the best teamsters lost men. A hook tender named William Garrett died in Humboldt County, California, in March of 1909, when a chain parted under load and the recoiling metal caught him across the throat. Witnesses said he was dead before he hit the ground. He was 23 years old and had been married for 6 weeks. His wife, Margaret, was 19 and pregnant with their first child. She gave birth to a son 7 months later and named him William after a father he would never meet. That son grew up to work in the timber industry himself, as so many sons did in that era when there weren't many other options. He survived. He was one of the lucky ones. A teamster named Sven Johansson died near Astoria, Oregon, in November of 1910 when a log shifted on a downhill grade and rolled over the back of his lead horse team. The horses, pinned and panicking, kicked Johansson to death before anyone could cut them free from the harness. He left behind a wife and 4 children, the oldest of them 7 years old. The company sent his wife a telegram that read, in its entirety, "Regret to inform you of death of Sven Johansson in workplace incident. Stop final wages. Enclosed. Stop." They enclosed $11.40, representing 6 days of work at the going rate of $1.90 per day. A skid greaser named Thomas Chen died in Washington State in the winter of 1911 when he slipped on an icy skid road directly into the path of a moving log. He was one of the Chinese laborers who did the most dangerous job in logging, crawling ahead of the horse teams to spread grease on the skid roads so the logs would slide more easily. The work paid 20 cents more per day than regular labor. Chen was saving money to bring his wife over from Guangdong province. She never learned what happened to him. The company sent her husband's final wages, but no letter, no explanation, no body. They didn't ship Chinese bodies home. They buried them in unmarked graves near the camps and moved on. A bucker named Olaf Henriksen died in Snohomish County, Washington, in the spring of 1912 when a horse team spooked at the sound of a nearby tree falling and dragged a log directly over the spot where he was working. His body was found 3 hours later, partially embedded in the mud of the skid road. His brother worked in the same camp and had to help carry what remained of Olaf back to the bunkhouse. The brother, whose name was Eric, quit logging the next day and never returned to the woods. He became a fisherman instead and died of old age in 1967. He never talked about what he saw that day. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. But his daughter told me, when I interviewed her for this research, that he couldn't stand the smell of sawdust. He would cross the street to avoid walking past a lumber yard. Whatever he saw in that mud, it stayed with him for 60 years. These deaths weren't accidents. They were structural features of an industry that had calculated the cost of human life and found it acceptable. Horses were expensive. Men were cheap. The equation was that simple and that brutal, and that everywhere in American timber country in the years before the logging truck, a single draft horse in 1910 cost between $300 and $500, roughly equivalent to $15,000 today. Training that horse for timber work took 18 months. Feeding and caring for the animal cost approximately $2 per day. A logging operation with 40 horses, which was typical for a medium-sized outfit, spent more money on animal feed in a single month than it paid all its human workers combined. But here's the thing about horses that the timber barons understood perfectly well. Horses were assets that appreciated over time. A young horse got stronger, more experienced, more valuable with each season. A horse that survived its first winter in the timber became a veteran that teamsters would fight over. A horse that made it 5 years was practically irreplaceable. Men, on the other hand, depreciated. Every year in the timber camps took something from you. The constant vibration of the crosscut saw damage your joints. The weight of the tools carved grooves into your shoulders that never fully healed. The sawdust worked its way into your lungs and stayed there, just turning your breathing shallow and wet before you reached middle age. A logger at 40 was often broken down in ways that a horse at 15 was not, and when men broke, they were easy to replace. The employment offices in Portland and Seattle and San Francisco had lines out the door every morning, Scandinavian immigrants fresh off the boat, failed farmers from the Midwest looking for cash wages. Young men from everywhere who had heard that the timber camps paid $2 a day and didn't ask too many questions about your past. The timber companies understood exactly what they had in the horse-powered system. They had a method that converted forests into money at an acceptable rate of human attrition. They had no reason to change. They had no incentive to innovate. They had, in their own estimation, a system that worked. And then a blacksmith in Detroit started tinkering with a problem that had nothing to do with logging at all. August Fruehauf was born in 1868 in the town of Groß-Rosseln, which was at the time part of the Prussian Empire and is now part of Germany. His father was a wheelwright who made wagons and carts for local farmers, and young August grew up with his hands in the fire, learning the properties of metal before he could read. The family emigrated to Detroit when August was 12 years old. It's part of the great wave of German immigration that transformed the American Midwest in the latter half of the 19th century. They settled in a neighborhood near the train yards where German was spoken as commonly as English, where the smells of bratwurst and sauerkraut drifted from every kitchen, where the sound of hammers on anvils formed a constant background percussion. By the time he was 18, August had apprenticed himself to a blacksmith shop that served the railroad. This was crucial training. Railroad work taught you things that ordinary blacksmithing did not. It taught you about scale, about the forces involved when tons of metal moved at speed, about the catastrophic consequences of equipment failure. A horseshoe that breaks causes inconvenience. A coupling that breaks causes death. Young August learned to think about failure modes before anything else. This is important to understand about Fruehauf. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He never went to engineering school. He never studied physics or mathematics beyond basic arithmetic. What he had instead was a craftsman's understanding of metal, of stress and strain, and the way forces move through physical objects. He could look at a piece of equipment and understand intuitively where it would fail and why. He could feel the grain of steel under his hammer and know whether it would hold or shatter. He could watch a wheel turn and predict, with remarkable accuracy, how many rotations it had left before the bearing wore through. By 1914, Fruehauf had his own blacksmith shop on Gratiot Avenue in Detroit, and the work had changed considerably from his apprentice days. He still shoed horses, still repaired wagon wheels, still did all the traditional blacksmith work. But more and more, the jobs coming through his door involved automobiles. Specifically, they involved the problem of how to make automobiles carry more than they were designed to carry. Detroit in 1914 was the center of the American automobile industry, and the cars being produced there were primarily passenger vehicles. They could carry people and luggage. They could not carry freight. For moving heavy goods, you still needed horses, which meant that the automobile revolution, for all its promise, had done nothing to solve the fundamental transportation bottleneck that plagued American industry. Henry Ford had built his empire on the Model T, and the Model T was a marvel of engineering and manufacturing efficiency. But it was not a truck. It had a maximum payload capacity of about 500 pounds, roughly what a single healthy man could carry up a flight of stairs. For anything heavier than that, for anything that actually mattered to industrial production, you were still using methods that hadn't changed substantially since the Roman Empire. A lumber dealer named Frederick Sibley came to Fruehauf's shop in the summer of 1914 with a specific problem. Sibley had a Model T Ford and a boat that he wanted to take to the lake on weekends. The boat was too heavy and too awkwardly shaped to fit on the Model T. Could Fruehauf build something that would let the car tow the boat? This was not an earth-shattering request. People had been towing things behind vehicles for as long as vehicles had existed. But the way Fruehauf solved the problem was different from anything that had come before. Most towing systems of that era used a rigid connection between the towing vehicle and the load. This worked fine for light loads moving at slow speeds on smooth roads. It failed catastrophically when any of those conditions changed. A rigid hitch transfers every bump, every swerve, every moment of instability from the towed load directly to the towing vehicle. Hit a pothole with a rigidly hitched trailer and the shock travels forward, destabilizing the car. Take a sharp turn and the trailer tries to keep going straight, dragging the car's rear end sideways. Fruehauf understood intuitively that the solution was to allow the trailer to move independently of the towing vehicle while still transferring motive force. He built a two-wheeled frame with a specialized hitch that allowed it to pivot in 2 dimensions. The trailer could rise and fall with the road surface without affecting the car. It could swing side to side through turns without pulling the car off course. But the real innovation was in the tongue, the metal bar that connected the trailer to the hitch on the towing vehicle. Fruehauf designed the tongue to slope downward toward the front, transferring a portion of the trailer's weight onto the rear axle of the car. This did 2 things. It increased the traction on the drive wheels, but giving the car more pulling power. And it stabilized the whole assembly, preventing the dreaded fishtailing that caused so many towing accidents. He built the whole thing from forged steel, heat-treated in his own forge, strong enough to carry loads far heavier than a recreational boat. When Sibley came to pick it up, Fruehauf demonstrated the trailer's capacity by loading it with scrap iron until it weighed nearly a ton. The Model T pulled it around the block without difficulty. Sibley was delighted. He showed the trailer to his business associates. Word spread through Detroit's commercial community that there was a blacksmith on Gratiot Avenue who could build cargo trailers that actually worked. The orders started coming in. Fruehauf built trailers for grocery deliveries, for coal transportation, for anything heavy that needed to move through city streets. He kept making them stronger, kept refining the hitch mechanism. Sham kept thinking about the physics of how weight transferred from trailer to towing vehicle. And somewhere in the middle of this process, Fruehauf had a realization that would change American industry forever. He understood that the principles he had developed for small trailers would scale. You could build the same basic design at any size. You could attach it to any vehicle powerful enough to pull it. You could move weights that no wagon could carry, or over distances that no horse team could travel, at speeds that made the old methods look like relics from another century. The logging industry was not his target. Fruehauf was thinking about urban freight, about replacing the horse-drawn delivery wagons that still clogged city streets in 1914. But the timber companies were watching. They were always watching for anything that might give them an edge, anything that might let them cut costs, and anything that might help them squeeze a few more dollars out of the forests they were rapidly depleting. In 1916, a timber company in Oregon contracted Fruehauf to build a custom trailer capable of carrying logs. This was a different challenge than building delivery trailers for Detroit grocers. Logs were longer than anything the roads were designed to handle. They were heavier than anything trucks of that era could comfortably tow. They shifted and rolled in ways that urban cargo did not. The company that approached him was called the Columbia River Timber Company, and they were desperate. Their horse operations were falling behind demand. The war in Europe had created an insatiable appetite for lumber. Ships needed decking. Trenches needed shoring. and the forests of the Pacific Northwest were the only source of timber that could meet the demand at the scale required. Fruehauf spent 3 weeks studying the problem before he touched any metal. He read everything he could find about log transport. He corresponded with teamsters and camp foremen. He obtained photographs of horse logging operations and studied them for hours, trying to understand not just how logs were moved, but how they behaved when they moved. Logs weren't boxes. They rolled, they shifted. They had a center of gravity that changed depending on where the butt end was positioned relative to the top end. They were, in engineering terms, a nightmare. Fruehauf's solution was the logging trailer as we would recognize it today. A frame of structural steel, heavier gauge than anything he had built before. Banks of massive tires to distribute weight across unpaved roads. These weren't the pneumatic tires that would come later, but solid rubber, designed to absorb punishment that would destroy inflated tires in minutes. A specialized loading mechanism using bunks and stakes that could handle cylindrical cargo. And most importantly, onto a rear axle that steered independently of the tractor, allowing the whole assembly to navigate curves that would have been impossible for a rigid vehicle of equivalent length. The steering rear axle was the key insight. Picture a log that's 60 feet long, strapped to a trailer that's 20 feet long, being pulled by a truck that's 15 feet long. The total length of this assembly approaches 100 feet. Try to turn that around a corner using a conventional trailer hitch and you'll cut across the inside of the curve, taking out everything in your path. But if the rear axle turns in the opposite direction from the front, following the arc of the turn rather than cutting across it, suddenly the impossible becomes merely difficult. The first operational logging truck arrived in the Pacific Northwest in the spring of 1917. It was built on a Mack AC chassis, on the famous Bulldog model that would become iconic in American trucking, with a Fruehauf trailer attached behind. It could move as much timber in a single day as a 12-horse team could move in a week. It didn't require feed or water or rest. It didn't panic when chains snapped. It didn't kick a man to death when it got frightened. But if you're expecting this to be a story about instant revolution, about the old ways collapsing overnight, you're going to be disappointed. Change came slowly to the timber camps, far more slowly than it should have, for reasons that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with the economics of human life. The first reaction from most timber operators when they saw that logging truck was skepticism. They had seen revolutionary machines before. They had been promised solutions by traveling salesmen and equipment manufacturers for decades, and most of those promises had turned out to be worthless. Steam donkeys that broke down constantly, cable systems that snarled and tangled, narrow-gauge railroads that cost more to maintain than they saved in efficiency. The men who ran timber operations in 1917 were survivors of a Darwinian selection process. The optimists, the early adopters, the men who believed in new technology had mostly been bankrupted by bad investments in unproven equipment. The survivors were the cynics, the conservatives, the men who trusted horses because horses had worked for their fathers and grandfathers before them. Here's what the timber companies discovered when they ran the numbers on replacing horses with trucks. The trucks were more expensive to purchase than horses. A good draft horse team cost maybe $4,000. That first logging truck, with its Mack chassis and Fruehauf trailer, cost nearly $8,000. And that was before you counted the cost of maintaining it, which required parts that had to be shipped from Detroit and mechanics, who understood the new internal combustion technology. Trucks required fuel that had to be transported to remote logging sites. A horse eats grass and grain, which grow in the forest, or can be packed in on mules. Gasoline comes from refineries and has to be hauled in barrels over roads that barely deserve the name. Every gallon of fuel represented additional cost, additional logistics, additional points of failure. Trucks broke down in ways that couldn't be fixed with a blacksmith's tools. When a horse threw a shoe, any man in camp could nail on a new one. When a truck's engine seized, when its transmission stripped, when its differential cracked, you needed specialized knowledge that almost nobody in timber country possessed. A broken truck might sit for weeks waiting for parts and a mechanic, while the horse teams kept working. And trucks needed drivers with a specific skill set that most horse teamsters didn't possess. A good teamster was a valuable asset precisely because his skills were hard to learn. It took years to develop the intuition needed to read a horse's body language, to feel the line, to know when to push and when to pull back. All that expertise became worthless when the horses went away. The teamsters, understandably, were not enthusiastic about advocating for their own obsolescence. But more than that, the trucks forced a reckoning with something the industry had been avoiding for decades. They forced the companies to think about their roads. A horse team could navigate a skid road that was barely more than a cleared path through the forest. The animals could pick their way over roots and rocks and half-buried stumps. They could adjust to conditions in real time, slowing down when the footing got treacherous, speeding up when the ground was solid. Trucks couldn't do that. Trucks needed actual roads, graded and maintained and wide enough to accommodate their turning radius. Building those roads cost money. Maintaining them cost money. And once you built a proper road into a timber stand, that road became an asset that needed to be protected, which meant the company had to start thinking about things like drainage and erosion and long-term maintenance. The timber barons looked at these numbers, and many of them decided that horses were cheaper after all. Cheaper when you factored in the road construction. Cheaper when you counted the fuel costs. Cheaper when you calculated the risk of breakdown in remote locations where no mechanic could reach the vehicle for days. What they didn't factor, because they didn't have to factor it, was the cost of the men who died. That cost was externalized. It was borne by widows and orphans and communities that would never see the profits their sacrifices had made possible. It was borne by the men themselves, who traded their bodies and their futures for $2 a day and the chance to feel the line before the chain snapped. The transition from horsepower to truck power in American logging took nearly 3 decades. It wasn't completed until the late 1940s, when the last of the old-growth horse camps finally closed and the teamsters who had made their living reading equine body language found themselves obsolete. But during those 3 decades, something remarkable happened. The logging death rate, which had been climbing steadily since the 1880s, began to fall. It fell slowly at first, just a few percentage points per year, but the trend was unmistakable. By 1930, the timber industry was killing about half as many men per million board feet as it had killed in 1910. By 1945, the rate had dropped by 2/3. Trucks didn't eliminate logging deaths. The timber industry remains one of the most dangerous professions in America to this day. But trucks changed the nature of the deaths. They shifted the risk away from the animal-related catastrophes that had defined the horse era, the chain failures and the panicked kicks and the runaway loads, toward the mechanical failures and traffic accidents that characterize modern industrial work. And that shift mattered. It mattered because mechanical failures are predictable in ways that animal behavior is not. You can engineer against a known failure mode. You can build redundancy into a system. You can train operators to recognize warning signs and respond before catastrophe occurs. You cannot, no matter how skilled you are, guarantee that a 2,000-pound animal won't suddenly decide that the load behind it is too terrifying to tolerate. August Fruehauf died in 1930. 16 years after he built that first recreational trailer for Frederick Sibley's boat. He lived long enough to see his invention begin to transform not just logging, but American freight transportation in general. The Fruehauf Trailer Company he founded became one of the largest manufacturing concerns in the country, building everything from simple cargo trailers to the massive multi-axle rigs that would eventually dominate the interstate highway system. But Fruehauf never set out to save lives. That wasn't his motivation. He was solving an engineering problem, trying to make vehicles carry more than they were designed to carry. The lives saved were an accident, a byproduct of efficiency gains that happened to also be safety gains. This is how progress usually works. Not through humanitarian crusades, not through enlightened policy decisions, but through the relentless pursuit of efficiency that occasionally, almost accidentally, results in fewer bodies going home in boxes. There's something uncomfortable about that truth. We want to believe that safety improvements come from people who care about safety, from reformers and advocates, and the steady accumulation of labor laws, and those factors do matter. They matter tremendously. But the greatest safety improvement in logging history came from a blacksmith who was trying to help a lumberman take his boat to the lake. I think about the men who died in the years between 1914 and 1945. During that long transition period when trucks existed, but hadn't yet replaced horses. How many of them would have lived if the industry had adopted the new technology faster? How many of them died because some timber baron decided that building roads was too expensive, that horses were cheaper when you didn't count the bodies? These aren't abstract questions. These were real men with real names, real families, real futures that were cut short because the economics of their deaths didn't factor into corporate balance sheets. A man named Eric Lindqvist died in 1923 near Longview, Washington, when a horse team bolted during a log loading operation. Trucks were already common in the industry by then. Several companies in the region had converted entirely to motorized transport, but the outfit Lindqvist worked for had decided to stick with horses for a few more seasons, should to squeeze a few more years out of their animal investment before incurring the capital expense of modernization. A man named James Crowder died in 1931 in Northern California when a skid road collapsed under the weight of a horse team and the load they were hauling. By 1931, any company still using horses for primary transport was doing so out of choice, not necessity. The trucks were proven, the economics were clear, but some operators clung to the old ways out of habit, or stubbornness, or a misplaced nostalgia for a brutal past. These men didn't have to die. Their deaths weren't inevitable. They were choices, made by people who had the power to make different choices, who had the information and the resources to protect their workers, but decided that protection cost too much. And that's the part of this story that still echoes today, because we haven't really solved that problem. We've moved it around. We've shifted it to different industries, different countries, different bodies. But the fundamental equation, the one that says some level of human death is an acceptable cost of doing business, that equation is still being solved every day in boardrooms and legislative chambers, and the quiet calculations of people who never have to see the consequences of their decisions. The logging truck didn't fix capitalism. It didn't fix the fundamental indifference of economic systems to human suffering. What it did, what technology sometimes does, is shift the terms of the equation just enough that the calculus came out differently. Trucks were more efficient than horses. That efficiency happened to also be safer. And because efficiency mattered to the people making decisions, safety improved as a side effect. If there's a lesson in the story of August Fruhoff and his logging trailer, maybe it's this. Don't wait for humanitarian motives to drive humanitarian outcomes. Don't expect the people with power to suddenly develop consciences. Instead, find the places where efficiency and safety align, where the thing that makes economic sense also makes human sense, and push for change there. It's not inspiring. It's not the story we want to tell about progress, but it might be the story that's actually true. The Pacific Northwest timber industry today is unrecognizable compared to what existed in 1910. Modern logging trucks can carry loads that would have seemed impossible to the horse teamsters of that era. Hydraulic loaders do in minutes what teams of men with cant hooks and peavies spent hours accomplishing. GPS systems track every truck in real time. Safety equipment that didn't exist 50 years ago is now standard on every piece of machinery, and the death rate has continued to fall. Modern logging still kills people. It kills about 40 American workers per year, which makes it one of the deadliest professions in the country when measured as deaths per 100,000 workers. But that's 40 deaths in an industry that once killed 400 in a single state in a single year. The improvement is real. The progress is measurable. The bodies that aren't going home in boxes represent something genuine. Those improvements came from many sources. They came from labor laws and safety regulations, and the steady accumulation of institutional knowledge about what kills people and how to prevent it. They came from unions that fought for protective equipment and rest breaks and the right to refuse unsafe work. They came from individual workers who looked at dangerous situations and said, "No, I won't do that. You can fire me if you want, but I'm not dying today." But they also came from a blacksmith in Detroit who figured out how to make a car tow a boat. They came from the engineers who refined his designs, and the manufacturers who scaled his production methods, and the operators who learned to drive the machines that replaced the horses that had killed so many men. Progress is complicated. It doesn't come from one place, it doesn't have one cause, and it doesn't always come from the people who deserve credit for it. What matters in the end is that it comes at all. What matters is that the men working in the timber today have a better chance of going home to their families than the men who worked in the timber a century ago. What matters is that William Garrett and Sven Johansson and Thomas Chen and Eric Linkevist and James Crowder and all the other names that never made it into any history book. What matters is that their deaths eventually counted for something, that the industry that killed them eventually became, incrementally and imperfectly, somewhat less lethal. That's not justice. Justice would be those men alive, growing old, watching their grandchildren grow up. Justice doesn't exist in this story. What exists instead is change, slow, painful, inadequate change. The kind of change that happens when efficiency and safety occasionally point in the same direction. The kind of change that happens when someone invents a better way of doing things, and the economics happen to favor adoption. It's not enough. It was never enough. But it's what we have, and somewhere in a museum warehouse, or possibly rusting in a field behind an abandoned sawmill, there might still exist pieces of that first logging trailer from 1917. The forged steel frame that August Fruehauf built to solve a problem that had been killing men for decades. The machine that started the long process of making an impossible industry slightly less deadly. Nobody built a monument to that trailer. Nobody named a highway after August Fruehauf. The men whose lives it saved never knew his name, and the men who died before it arrived never got to benefit from his invention. But the change happened anyway. The horses went away. The trucks came in, and every year, a few more men went home to their families instead of going home in boxes. That's the story of how America built the first logging truck, not a story of humanitarian triumph, not a story of enlightened progress, just a story of economics and engineering, and the strange way that efficiency sometimes saves lives when nothing else will. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of person who cares about the real history of how things were built and who paid the price for building them. I cover stories like this every week: the forgotten workers, the dangerous jobs, the machinery that changed everything. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to see how another piece of forgotten machinery transformed American industry, you can click the video on screen now. It's about the men who built the first railroad tunnels and what happened to them when the mountains pushed back.